Thank you again. Hope you're enjoying the weekend. We're starting our program for the afternoon, and Michael Mandelbaum, Professor Emeritus, will kick us off this afternoon. I will just turn it right over to Professor Mandelbaum.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I've played this room before, but seldom, if ever, with such a distinguished audience. I've always said that one of the greatest satisfactions of a SAIS professor, or any professor, I guess, is to see former students gainfully employed. Because it means that whatever we did or didn't teach you, at least we didn't interfere with your career prospects. And I take it that this audience consists of people who are gainfully employed or, like me, are gainfully unemployed by choice, that is, retired. The subject or the title of my remarks today is The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth. And not coincidentally, that is the title of a new book that I am publishing with Oxford University Press on March 1st, 2019. So I will extract from that book three of the major propositions. The book is largely contemporary history, but it has a series of arguments, and I will give you three of the most important, and then go on to discuss where the book, subject of the book, the propositions that I adduce have left the world, and what this means for American foreign policy, subject that I had the privilege of teaching some of you in years past. So, proposition one. The 25 years between the opening of the Berlin Wall and the Russian invasion of Ukraine constituted a golden quarter century. They were the most peaceful years. This was the most peaceful period in all of modern history and arguably in all of recorded history. How can I say that? Well, it isn't that nobody was killed. It isn't that there wasn't violence. It isn't that there weren't massacres. But during this period, there wasn't the event that traditionally takes the greatest toll, that is, great power war. Well, there have been other periods where there was no great power war, the Cold War, for example. But what made this period, at least in my judgment, distinctively, uniquely peaceful was that not only was there no war among the strongest states, there were no preparations for war. There was no real thought of war. There was no specter of war hovering in the background, driving the calculations of the leaders of the major countries. There was an absence of what political scientists call security competition. Why was this so? How did this come about? Well, I believe that it came about because of the unusually robust international presence of three peace-promoting features of international politics. First, benign American hegemony. Second, economic interdependence, trade and investment. Third, global democracy. The world was, and continues to be, despite some backsliding, more democratic than ever before in its history. And these three features of the world all conduced to peace and reinforced each other. Now, this does not mean that any of these features, individually or in concert with the others, guarantees peace. Nothing guarantees peace. But it does mean that they push toward a peaceful world and did so more powerfully, I argue, than at any other time in history. Second thesis, this golden age of peace on earth ended. It's over. We're not living in that world anymore. In fact, one of the working titles for this book that I thought of was Paradise Lost. But then somebody told me that it had been used for some other work. Peace ended as and because three major powers, one in each of the three most contested regions of the world, decided that it wished to overturn the status quo and was willing to use force to do so. These three were Russia in Europe, China in East Asia, and Iran in the Middle East. The three major chapters of The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth describe how and why this happened in each of these three parts of the world. Why did it happen? What motivated these three countries? Well, motives are complicated. There was more than one motive in each case, but there is one motive that runs like a red thread through the three cases, although it was more powerful in the Russian case than in the Chinese one, and more powerful in the Chinese case than in the Iranian case. In all three countries, to one extent or another, there was a dictatorial, autocratic regime existing in what is still a basically democratic world, feeling acutely the need for public support and legitimacy, and unable to draw that support from the familiar sources. In the Russian and Chinese cases, ideology was not a source of support and legitimacy because they both discarded orthodox Marxism-Leninism. China is still a communist country in important ways, but nobody really believes in the tenets of what they would call and did call Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. These countries, or at least the first two, relied very heavily on economic growth. Their pitch to the people they governed was, we'll keep all the power, but we'll make you richer and richer, don't make any trouble. But for all three, the prospects for economic growth by the end of the golden quarter century had dimmed. They'd fallen off a cliff in the case of Russia. When Vladimir Putin returned to the presidency, the price of oil had plummeted, and the price of oil is solely the sole determination of Russian economic growth, or at least almost the sole determinant. So Russia was already failing to grow economically, and the basis on which Putin had established himself during his first term in office had disappeared. Growth prospects in China had certainly not fallen off a cliff. In fact, the Chinese economic prospects are very bright by Western standards, but they're not as bright as they used to be. The Chinese face the necessity of switching to a different model for economic growth, one that they cannot reasonably expect to give them double-digit annual increases in their economy. They can't expect 10% growth anymore. 5% would be marvelous for any Western country, but the Chinese leadership is used to something better and had to worry that all of the problems that stir in Chinese society might get more acute if they couldn't deliver at the level to which the people of China had become accustomed. And therefore, and this is the argument that I make, and therefore these regimes turn to another source of political support and legitimacy, namely aggressive nationalism. They presented their peoples with the pitch that they were undertaking the campaigns necessary to restore and secure their country's rightful place in the world and to ward off the predatory assaults of their enemies in the West, especially the United States. I believe that this explains almost all of the Putin foreign policy, and especially his invasion of eastern Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. aggressive nationalism becomes a way of generating support, which leads to a third thesis. How, if at all, could peace be restored? Well, my argument is peace would be restored if and as Russia, China, and Iran became full-fledged liberal democracies. Of the three peace-inducing features that I've mentioned, I believe that democracy is the strongest. And those of you who studied international relations here with Professor Duran, or indeed with me or anybody, will recognize that I am embracing the so-called democratic peace theory, the argument that democracies don't fight one another, and therefore, to the extent that the world is democratic, it will be peaceful. It's a contested thesis, like all theses in the study of politics, but it's one that I believe in and argue in favor of. Now, there is an important implication of this third thesis for the study of politics, and especially for the study of international relations. Most of you will recall that the dominant or a dominant school of thought in the study of international relations is the so-called realist school. And realists, to oversimplify a bit, believe that conflict is built into the system and can never really be abolished. It's in the nature of things. It's in the DNA of the world. So for realists, even if they think that the 25 years after the opening of the Berlin Wall were as peaceful as I claim, they also would regard that as an aberration. It's just the result of a confluence of historical circumstances that are abnormal and cannot be repeated. I argue the contrary, but the contrary argument, that real peace is possible, in this context ends with a kind of good news, bad news verdict. The good news is we have a formula for peace. Peace about which people have dreamed since biblical times. We now know how to do it. We have the formula. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is we don't know how to apply the formula. We don't know how to make Russia, China, or Iran democratic. We don't know whether they ever will be democratic. What we do know, and what we learned to our cost during this golden quarter century, and which was one of the subjects of my previous book called Mission Failure, is that imposing democracy from the outside, even on countries smaller and weaker than the three current disturbers of the peace, is a very, very difficult and perhaps even impossible project. So there we are. But where does the world stand now? What is the world like? How can we describe international relations in the wake of the post-Cold War peace? Well, we live in a world that resembles the world of the Cold War that some of us remember well, and resembles it in three important ways. First, there are serious challenges to the existing order. Second, the champions of the status quo, those who like the existing order and want to resist it being overturned by force, all group around the United States. The United States is the champion of a particular international order that is in question. And therefore, third, the task of the countries that wish to defend against the attempted overturning of this system in these three crucial regions, themselves face twin tasks: to deter and contain Russia, China, and Iran. And you will recognize deterrence and containment as the central pillars of American foreign policy in the Cold War era. But it's important to bear in mind that the world of 2018 also differs in three fundamental ways from the world of the Cold War. First, the threat to the status quo is not a single unified threat. During the Cold War, the threat came from international communism with its headquarters in Moscow. Now, there are three challengers, not one, and although they coordinate to some extent, Russia, China, and Iran are separate actors with independent interests. A second difference: unlike the Cold War, the status quo today does not face an ideological challenge. The Soviet Union was a bearer of a radical anti-liberal ideology. The Soviet Union wished to make not just the international system, but the member countries in it over in its own image. It had a distinctive political system and a distinctive form of economic organization. That is not true, at least in the case of Russia and China. They don't have a distinctive system that they're actively trying to propagate and spread. And in fact, both regimes, the regime in both countries, has taken the position that there should be no outside interference in any country's domestic arrangements. A very different proposition from the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. A third important difference with implications for policy, although, as I'll say in a moment, it's not entirely clear what those implications are, is that unlike the Soviet Union, Russia, China, and Iran in 2018 are very much a part of the American and European-centered global economy. The countries that oppose Russia, China, and Iran also trade with and invest with them and invest in them. And that means that economic levers, economic instruments, are at least potentially an instrument of foreign policy now in a way that was not the case during the Cold War. Finally, what does this mean for the United States? What is to be done by us? Well, logically, the United States would carry out a modified version of its Cold War policies. In the post-Cold War era, continuity would dictate that the United States maintain, refurbish, and expand its coalitions in each of these three regions for the purpose of deterring and containing the challengers, and would use economic instruments for that purpose where and when possible. This is logical, and in my view, it is the proper course for the United States. But such a policy faces two sets of problems, and I will conclude by mentioning them. One set has to do with the difficulties of all coalitions. First, there is the free rider problem, which you will all recognize from your courses in microeconomics. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. Everybody wants to stave off the challenges of these three challenging powers, but nobody wants to pay for it. And that leaves the leader of the coalition, the United States, paying a disproportionate share of the cost, and that will continue to be true going forward. For example, in Europe, the non-American members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are, in military terms, somewhere between unimpressive and toothless. And no matter how much the American president, whoever he or she is, nags them, that's not going to change dramatically. In East Asia, the non-Chinese allies of the United States are involved in more robust military buildups. They are more serious about defense spending and military strength than are the Europeans. But in East Asia, the principal challenge from China at the moment is a maritime one and has to be met by naval forces, and only the United States has the naval forces necessary for the job. So here again, a disproportionate share of the burden falls on the United States. And in the Middle East, as in Europe, for example, the Arab members of the loosely organized American coalition are, to say the least, unimpressive in military terms. Second difficulty with all coalitions. There are conflicts within each coalition, and this is natural and normal. A coalition consists of countries that have some interests in common, but not all interests, and some interests that conflict with one another. And this is true in all three regions. Europe, as we know, is divided where economic policy is concerned between the northern and southern members of the European Union. And on geostrategic matters, Europe is divided between East and West. The Baltic countries and Poland are terrified of Russia. Germany wants to trade with Russia. The southern members of NATO, southern members of the European Union are just not interested. It doesn't seem relevant to them. Similarly, in East Asia, for historic reasons, the two strongest pro-American powers there, Japan and South Korea, have very poor relations and find it difficult to cooperate. In the Middle East, almost everybody has a grievance against almost everybody else. To take one example, the Turks are formidable champions of the so-called Muslim Brotherhood, whereas the Egyptians, and as we have learned recently, the Saudis, regard the Muslim Brotherhood as their mortal enemy. A third problem with these coalitions is that although there is the potential for using economic leverage for the purpose of containing and deterring Russia, China, and Iran, it's not at all easy to do so. Europeans, for example, especially Germany, but other European countries, rely heavily on Russian energy and are very circumspect about economic sanctions. They've been willing to apply some sanctions in the case of the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine, but there's presumably a limit beyond which they will feel they are not able to go. Similarly, in East Asia, the problem is even more acute. For every one of the non-Chinese countries in East Asia, all of which want to resist Chinese domination of the region, the People's Republic of China is either their largest or one of their three largest trade partners. And they certainly don't want to sacrifice that trade. Their policy, or at least their policy preference, therefore, is for the United States to confront China and for they themselves to do nothing, to keep on trading, to hold America's coat, as it were. So there are difficulties in managing and mobilizing these coalitions, even in a world in which the United States was committed to a kind of policy continuity in which the United States would lead in containing and deterring the three challenging powers. But there is a second set of problems that follows from the first, or it follows from a question that the first set raises, and that is, will the United States really do this? Will the United States practice continuity? Will the United States be willing to sustain its leading role in the world in these changed circumstances? And here, too, there are problems, and these are problems all apart from the apparent disinclination to undertake this role on the part of the current president. First, as we all know, the United States is sharply polarized politically. Now, it's not particularly polarized on foreign policy issues, but foreign policy issues require, in order for the United States to be effective, a certain degree of national unity. There was a broad consensus between Republicans and Democrats in waging the Cold War, and it's not at all clear that that degree of consensus necessary to underpin an effective foreign policy can be regained and sustained. Second, we have a fiscal crunch coming. Now, I published a book 10 years ago called The Frugal Superpower, which predicted that this crunch was imminent. So far, I have proven to be a false prophet. But nonetheless, the country is piling up debt, is running large annual deficits, aggravated by the recent tax cuts, and in addition, has a growing bill for entitlements for Social Security and Medicare as people such as I retire and start to claim these benefits. That means that at the very least, there's going to be less money available for foreign policy in the future because of the other claims on the American purse and on American taxpayers. Third, there is still, in public opinion, a backlash against recent foreign policy disappointments. The disappointments of the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. People are more reluctant than they were before these two interventions to undertake forward-deployed, robust, conceivably even militarized American foreign policy. A president who is inclined to engage in a comparable set of policies would face an uphill climb in persuading the American public to support them. Which brings me to my concluding thought. The great question overhanging American foreign policy, the United States, and, because American foreign policy is always much more important to other countries than it is to the United States, over the world as a whole is, what role will the United States play in this new post-Cold War world? Will it continue the kinds of policies that it adopted in the wake of World War II and are therefore more than 7 decades old? We simply don't know. What I think we can be confident of, however, is that if the United States does not continue this role, the world as a whole will be a less prosperous, less peaceful place. Thank you. I want to note that none of you is responsible for any of that on the exam. And the floor is open for questions and discussion. Peter.
Yeah, would you comment on how economically sustainable you think the policies are of these 3 countries that you mentioned?
Russia and Iran are not pursuing, and under their present regimes probably cannot pursue, economically sustainable policies, if by economically sustainable policies you mean serious economic growth. The Russians can't do it because they depend on energy and they're not making the changes needed to have a serious economy. The Iranians have never done it. One of the dirty little secrets of the Middle East is that not only has the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, been a consistent economic failure, but the performance of the regime that it ousted, the Shah, was much, much better. No comparison at all. The Shah was an economic success, although obviously a political failure. But these are regimes where the leader is willing to, and the leading group is willing to use a lot of force against their own people to stay in power, and precisely because they are economic failures, they have what seems to me, or at least given my analysis, is an ever-increasing incentive to make trouble beyond their borders. If I were living in one of the Baltic countries, I would be nervous about Putin because I think he's going to feel the need for another foreign policy, quote, success, unquote. And Iran has already launched a project of dominating the Middle East and has done extraordinarily well, considering how relatively weak economically it is. China is a different story because China is the great economic success of our time. And even if Chinese policies turn out not to be optimized for the new era, it's likely that China will continue to grow rather substantially. Whether it will grow substantially enough to give the regime the economic wherewithal to keep the peace and forestall the need for foreign adventures, hard to say. And, of course, there's always the possibility of some kind of mishap. The debt level is very high. There's a housing bubble, apparently. Of course, I've been hearing that for 5 years. But the chance for some 2008-style financial calamity in China, I think we have to say, is not zero. I don't know how great it is. My suspicion is it's not very great, but it's not zero. So that's the best I can do in response to that question. Over here.
Yeah, David Baker from class of '68. Looking at you talked about the naval presence of the United States and the role that inevitably it would have to play. Do you see a potential tinderbox developing in the South China Sea and the little islets that they're developing, or is this part of China's effort to project its power?
It is part of China's effort to project its power, but bear in mind that China is claiming maritime territory that other countries claim, and China's claims are contrary to international law, and the international court found against them in a suit that the Philippines brought, and the Chinese said, we're not paying any attention to that. Wars begin, historically, over contested territory, and this is contested territory, not land, but so we have a familiar cause of war. The United States has been relatively reticent about challenging the Chinese, very reticent in the last administration. The Obama administration simply didn't want to challenge the Chinese in any serious way. The Navy was pushing for more robust versions of what they call freedom of navigation operations, and a few were conducted. This administration seems, at least rhetorically, more inclined to challenge Chinese claims, but it hasn't changed much. It hasn't changed the tempo of operations or the scope of operations much, at least as far as I know, as far as has been announced. But all of which is to say that there is a real possibility of a conflict, of an American ship sailing in a place that the Chinese claim is theirs. Chinese tell the United States to get out. The United States says we're within our rights, and then who knows what happens. So the chances there are not at all zero.
Hi, I'm Ivar Kuskovics from the class of '93. It may be too early it may be too early to tell from this immediate point in our recent past, but is there something to be said for the deterrence of unpredictability? And here I'm talking about U.S. foreign policy leadership. Are we actually at an advantage if nobody knows what to expect from us?
Well, no, it's a serious question, and some of you may recall that Richard Nixon subscribed in part to that view of deterrence. It became known as the madman theory, but it was used as negotiating leverage, or there was an attempt to use it, or Nixon wanted to use it, as leverage in negotiations with the North Vietnamese once negotiations were underway. He told Kissinger to tell the North Vietnamese that they should settle, that they should make the kind of deal the United States wanted, because the American president was a madman and there was no telling what he might do if he were thwarted. I don't think that that tactic is thought retrospectively to have worked particularly well. And there are two arguments for steadiness and predictability in deterrence, especially in the current situation. First of all, the United States is or should be defending not just the status quo, but the legitimate legal international order. And therefore, what the United States ought to be defending are red lines that have international standing. Second, if you are unpredictable, you might get some added bang for your deterrence buck, but you also risk war by accident. You risk a country crossing a red line, not understanding that that's what it was doing, and the United States then responding in an unpredictable way. And incidentally, that is, in some sense, the history of American foreign policy. That is to say, the Korean War broke out because the North Koreans crossed the demilitarized zone. But it seems clear in retrospect that they never remotely expected the United States to intervene. And if they had expected the United States to intervene, they might not have done it. Now, that's all counterfactual and conjectural. And then there was at one point a long revisionist debate about whether Atchison had unintentionally given them the green light by making a speech about the American security perimeter that did not include Korea. And the response to that charge against Atchison was that he was in no political position to do it because the Congress was certainly not inclined to defend Korea. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that the United States didn't know that it was going to defend Korea until it had to do so, and it wasn't predictable. I think the same thing was true for the first Gulf War. Saddam didn't believe that the United States would intervene, and once again, there's a kind of revisionist controversy about what the American ambassador at the time, April Glaspie, said to Saddam. Was April Glaspie a SAIS graduate? Does anybody remember? Was she? Okay, well, so SAIS started the war. Again, I think that was unfair. She didn't have authorization to go beyond what she told Saddam. But it does seem, in retrospect, plausible that if he had anticipated what the United States would do, he wouldn't have invaded Kuwait. But it's also, I think, the case that the United States didn't know what it would do. It wasn't prepared to draw a red line. Kuwait wasn't an ally. In fact, it was the country, I think, that voted most consistently against the United States in the United Nations, or at least it was in the top tier. So I guess what I would say is, while there are at least theoretical advantages to unpredictability, I would say that at least I would come down more on the side of predictability, and that the United States has an inherently unpredictable foreign policy simply because, as a global power, it's hard to say in advance. It's hard for us to say what we will do, or it has proven hard for us to say what we will do until the time comes to do it. Pam, I think that you're going to get the mic, yes.
Could you comment on the U.S. military in this debate today and the strength of the military and their attitudes towards these issues?
Well, you know, we do have civilian control of the military, so the military takes its marching orders from the civilians. Sometimes those orders aren't very clear, and in the current administration, I gather they're not very clear. But I get the impression, in fact, it's more than an impression, that in the Obama administration, the chief of naval operations, Admiral Harris, he was CINCPAC, I think, at the time, and then became CNO. And I quote him in The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, wanted to conduct more robust freedom of navigation operations, and the administration said no. So there was some tension there, but there was no question of the Navy going rogue. There's also the question of how do you defend the three Baltic countries against Russia. This, and I go into this in the book, this is a 21st century version in important ways, although not in every ways, of the problem of defending West Berlin during the Cold War. That is, like West Berlin, the Baltic countries, given that they're so small and so close to Russia, are not readily defensible by non-nuclear means. I suppose in theory you could stuff enough Western troops into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to ward off a Russian assault. But it's a serious problem, and it's a NATO problem. But people are working on it. The United States faces an inherent budgetary problem, not just because there are alternative demands for American resources that American taxpayers and American voters care about more than foreign policy, namely their own benefits, but also because the United States is a global power and has responsibilities all over the world, and that's expensive. And, as I noted, the United States is getting less help than would be optimal from other countries, and that's particularly true in Europe. Europeans are rich. They have great military traditions, although in some cases they're traditions we are anxious to keep buried, in the German case. But nonetheless, they certainly could do more, but they've shown no inclination to do more. Now, there is not going to be the scenario for which NATO planned and that the West feared during the Cold War, that is a thrust westward from the middle of Germany, an effort to repeat the Blitzkrieg of 1940. That's not going to happen. Russia is not powerful enough to sustain the kinds of forces that the Soviet Union fielded. So the challenge is not all that great. And the challenge in the Middle East is not all that great either, because Iran is hardly a superpower, and the American military presence is going to be air and naval. We're not going to put troops on the ground in the Persian Gulf and to any great extent. China's a separate matter. Nonetheless, defense is expensive. And so there is always going to be more demand than supply when it comes to the American military.
Mike Van Dusen, 68. I guess we're coming up here pretty soon to some tougher sanctions on Iran, November 5th, and an effort by the administration to bring Iranian oil exports down to zero. You talked about red lines that don't have much international support. I'm wondering how you see that play out, and what Europe, what China do at that point.
Well, it's a good question. I should say that I count myself an opponent of the Iran deal, which I suspect was not your position, Mike. And so what you think about this, about the Trump policy, at least at first, it depends on what you think of the deal. I thought it was a very poor deal. I thought that it was basically an open road to the bomb for a variety of reasons, and that it would have to be revisited sooner or later if the United States was determined to keep Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And it was never clear to me whether the Obama administration really was, or how high a priority it put on that. But that's a matter of judgment. So if you take the position, as I did, that it would have to be revisited sooner or later, and that wasn't necessarily everybody's position, although it was due to expire. I mean, it was time limited. Then the question is, are you better off revisiting it sooner rather than later? And I think there is a case for doing it sooner. The case against doing it sooner is that it would have been desirable to get a consensus, at least with the Western countries, about reimposing the sanctions before going ahead. And also getting a consensus on what would be an acceptable improvement on the deal that you could ask of the Iranians, which they might or might not be willing to give. That hasn't happened. But there are, as you know, secondary sanctions, and my expectation is that the sanctions will be relatively effective, especially because Iran is among the most economically mismanaged countries in the world, and the regime is unpopular. So I think it will put more pressure on the regime. And the name of the game is to put enough pressure on to get a better deal. We'll see whether that happens. Now, it's also true that, in theory, the Chinese and the Russians could undercut the new sanctions if they wanted to. They could subsidize the Iranian regime. They're certainly not going to go along, at least publicly, with the new sanctions, although they were pretty good on the old sanctions. And one of the reasons that I thought it was a bad deal is I thought there was much more leverage than the Obama administration actually used. Very difficult to get them back into line. But whether they will exert themselves to circumvent, break, or undercut the sanctions, I'm rather dubious. I don't think it's worth it to them. I think the Russians have mixed feelings, as do the Chinese. They're happy to see the United States on its back foot. On the other hand, they don't want Iranian nukes. It's not in their interest. The Russians, because they, after all, are within range of Iran, and they profess to be unworried about the Islamic Republic. I doubt that that's really true. And the Chinese, because they still need oil from the Middle East, and they don't want things going wrong there. That would be economically disastrous for them. So while my expectation is that the Russians and the Chinese will not be on board for the sanctions, I don't think that they will act in ways that will prevent the sanctions from increasing the economic pressure on the Islamic Republic. That's a guess. We don't know, but that would be my guess. Henry.
Henry Newsom, class of '08. You seem to subscribe to the democratic peace theory. I vaguely recall a corollary of that as countries democratize, they enter a more dangerous phase before reaching the paradise. Now, I passed my exam, I think, with mediocrity, so maybe I'm mistaken. But if I'm not mistaken and that recollection is correct, are we, and you mentioned democracy as the most important of the three components, is there this risky stage in the next, even if we eventually see these countries democratize in the next few decades?
No, that's a fair recollection, a fair point. And there is some literature that argues that the democratizing phase is dangerous because when you switch from an autocratic regime to a democratic regime, suddenly you have electoral competition. And political parties trying to get votes will often rely on nationalism, since that's a very powerful emotion. And relying on nationalism can lead to aggressive foreign policies. And there's a fair amount of literature explaining the Balkan Wars in those terms. So that is a danger. I myself wrote a book about all this in 2006, I think, called Democracy's Good Name. And my argument there, and I recycle it in The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, is that democracy is a kind of prophylactic against war, but it's democracy properly understood, what's sometimes called liberal democracy. And the point of that book is that democracy as we know it, contemporary democracy, is really a hybrid form of government. It involves popular sovereignty, that is, the people choose the government, and the protection of liberty. Historically, those two things were regarded as incompatible. Democracy was a dirty word in the 18th century, and the founders of the United States and the framers of the Constitution certainly didn't want what they understood to be a democracy. That's, for example, the reason we have the Electoral College, because they didn't trust the people to choose the first magistrate. It's the reason that senators were elected were chosen by state legislatures, not by popular election, till the 20th century. But these two previously incompatible or presumed incompatible political features fused at the end of the 19th century, and the fusion has proven pretty stable. But my argument is you have to have both. That mere popular sovereignty can lead to tyranny of the majority and excessive nationalism. So that's how I get out of the criticism that you properly raised. We're almost at the end. We're past the end. I guess I could do one more question. I thought there was one other hand, but it was over there, and I don't see it. So I guess this is.
Well, to follow up, as you look out the world today, you can also see democracies retreating under certain circumstances. And I think there's some very troublesome trends that we see in Europe and other places around the world, and in the United States, but I say so.
Well, I don't. If you don't like Trump, and I would wager there aren't many, if any, fans of Trump in this room, and I'm not a fan of Trump. I've sometimes wondered whether it's more troublesome to think that this is a perversion of democracy or that this is a consequence of democracy. I mean, what if this is what people really want? This is the United States. But that notwithstanding, it is generally thought among students of democracy that there's been backsliding, sometimes called a democracy recession. I myself don't worry all that much about Poland and Hungary. But there's no doubt that the current governments in Poland and Hungary, well, there's no doubt they don't meet EU standards. So that's an EU problem. But I think it is also true historically, and the history of democracy really isn't all that old, because you can't really count the ancient Greeks. The history of modern democracy isn't all that old, but there is a pattern of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's true of a lot of things in social and political life. And so I think it's not unreasonable to believe that that's what we're seeing, and that at some point there will be another great or modest leap forward. We don't know when. Okay. Thank you all very much.
So it's been a crazy week for me, as most of the weeks have been lately. So I feel like I'm coming to this, not having done my homework or not having studied for the oral exam, but at least this way I'm the one questioning the SAIS professors instead of the other way around. I'm Michelle Kellerman. I cover the State Department for NPR, and I was a 1993 graduate. I spent a long time at SAIS, but, and met my husband there, Benoit Bosquet, who's in the room. We have a very broad idea for the panel, democracy in the world. So we're going to see how we can take that in bite sizes here. But we have all these great professors here. We have Charles Duran, who many of you probably had as a professor. He's the Andrew Mellon Professor of International Relations. We have Liesl Hintz, who's the Assistant Professor of International Relations and European Studies. And we have Matthias Matthes, I'm going to try to pronounce that correctly, who is an Assistant Professor of International Political Economy, and he's also a more recent SAIS graduate, much younger SAIS graduate than the rest of us here. Some of you may know that I spent the last week on this trip with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Saudi Arabia and to Turkey, trying to see how or if the Trump administration was going to deal with this, a key Middle East partner, Saudi Arabia, after this grisly murder of the Washington Post columnist and a critic of the Saudi Crown Prince. I've hardly had time to kind of sit back and take a broader look at it, but I'm hoping to use that kind of as a starting point of where we are, the threats to democracy in the world. Obviously, Turkey leaked a lot of information about it, but it has its own interests. It's not like Erdogan is a big supporter of press freedoms. So I want to start with Liesl Hintz because she's an expert on Turkey and she's been really looking at this issue. To talk a little bit about the motivations of the Turks here in this situation.
Sure. So I think this is actually a pretty nice starting point in terms of such a broad concept of democracy in the world. So let's start from a sort of a very narrow way of thinking about it, one case in one country in one time period, and then let's see if we can kind of broaden it out. So I appreciate this question. It's been fascinating for me to follow what's been going on. Turkey right now is, as we've been seeing, as you said, has been leaking a lot of information through some of its U.S. English newspaper correspondents, revealing that they probably have some intelligence, they probably have a tape, they probably have IDs of the Saudis that they believe were involved. They say now that they actually sent some Turkish intelligence officials to the airport to try and stop one of the planes that was carrying some of the Saudis on it from leaving Turkey. So this is all happening in the context of this journalist who became a Washington Post correspondent, Jamal Khashoggi, and was trying to obtain his marriage papers in terms of trying to marry a Turkish woman. What's fascinating about this is that he had been to the Saudi consulate a few days prior. They told him to come back. On the day that he went to the consulate, the local staff were told not to come into work. So there's many things that are slightly suspicious about this, right? But on many angles and from many positions. And as someone, as you point out, Erdogan and the Turkish state currently under the ruling Justice and Development Party, or AKP, is not at all friendly to journalists. This is not something that Erdogan is happy about because it looks as though he can't control what happens on his territory, and he is very proud of his sovereignty, so he's very frustrated about this. But it would be very hypocritical for him to say, how dare you attack journalists when Turkey has become the largest jailer of journalists in the world, more than China, more than Iran, more than Saudi. And not just jailings of journalists, but of lawyers, of academics, of any individual who has spoken out against Turkey's forays into Syria, spoken out against the war against the Kurds in Turkey itself. So within, I would say, about the past 5 years, since 2013, the Gezi Park incident, where you had this very small, initially environmental protest, it was basically about 10 people kind of camped out around a tree in a sort of a park in Istanbul that even I wouldn't have walked through at night. It wasn't really this amazing green space that we've now come to think about. But it turned into a nationwide protest overnight. By 2 days later, 80 of 81 provinces saw some kind of protest due to the massive police crackdown and the media silence. So since that episode of kind of catalyzing protest against the government, of really then suppressing any kind of dissent, we've seen Turkey, sort of a Turkey that was on a bit of a democratizing path, really regress quite a bit. We've seen a consolidation of the power in the executive through institutional reforms having to do with a referendum that was held in April of last year. We see Erdogan using unprecedented electoral manipulation to ensure that he wins the presidential election this year. That actually hadn't been the case. His party had been doing pretty well, but not well enough. So there was some manipulation to ensure that he rules. And that from a foreign policy perspective, to tie this back to your question, is trying to unhinge Turkey from its traditional transatlantic alliance. Turkey is, of course, a NATO member and an aspiring EU country, although I think it's pretty clear Turkey doesn't have any EU future under the current government, and the Turkish government has made that quite clear as well. But trying to carve its own niche in the region as an independent Sunni Muslim power, hopefully Sunni Muslim leader in the region. Now, who does it run up against in that? Saudi. So you have two ideologically opposed potential Sunni Muslim leaders in the region. And Egypt would probably like to say that it has a hand in that fight as well. Obviously, the Turkish government supports the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Qatar in the recent GCC crisis, whereas Saudi has lined up with Egypt and the UAE and so forth. Turkey, with its current economic crisis, has found itself very isolated. So it's walking an extremely fine line with Saudi right now, trying not to upset it, not confronting it directly. Even today, those officials who say that they still have this information say, well, we're not making any accusations, we just want to know what happened. So all of these leaks that we're talking about, I think, are really trying to let the international community know that we have some information, we don't want to necessarily reveal it directly, but we're interested in who will pay us for that information, in a sense.
And what do you think they want from the U.S.? I mean, the U.S. is an ally. There was this whole Pastor Brunson case that kind of blocked everything for a while. Brunson is out. There are still several Americans being held and several State Department employees being held. What does Erdogan want out of the U.S., and how do you think the Trump administration has been handling this?
So I think this is a really important question as well, and it has to do with democracy, because I think in the past, Turkish foreign policy was perhaps a little constrained, certainly with its EU accession, but now that it's, again, kind of unhinging itself from the West, now that it sees in the U.S. a president who doesn't seem to feel the need to adhere to democratic ideals, someone who blatantly says that business interests are my main concern, and this person isn't a U.S. citizen, and so therefore he's not my concern. I think that Turkey is taking a very transactional approach to its relationship with the U.S. I would actually not call Turkey an ally at this point. Formally, we have an institutional alliance, but the fact that it's purchased a S-400 missile defense system from Russia, the fact that it was militarily aligned against the YPG, that is the Syrian Kurdish forces that the U.S. was arming in the fight against ISIS, that Erdogan basically said, you have a pastor, that is Fethullah Gulen, whom Turkey blames for the July coup. I have a pastor, Andrew Brunson, let's make a deal. Literally said that. So I think it's a very transactional relationship. What they want, I think, is first and foremost, Turkey's economic crisis is shaping its foreign policy right now. Yes, the Brunson issue, that is Trump kind of taking to Twitter to declare sanctions on Turkey in terms of doubling aluminum steel tariffs right at the exact same time that the finance and treasury minister, who by the way is the son-in-law of Erdogan, was making a speech trying to reassure audiences and like investors and stuff. And here all of a sudden we have a doubling of steel tariffs, which is not good for Turkey because they export a lot of steel. So the timing was bad. But the economy was in a really bad state to begin with, and the lira was already in a free fall. That just exacerbated it. I think that what Turkey wants is to have the fines. Sorry, this is going to get really complicated. There is a fine that is potentially pending on a case that was decided in a U.S. court against a Turkish bank, Halkbank, that was engaged in an oil for gold trading scandal to try to evade U.S. sanctions on Iran. And that's a potential multi-billion-dollar fine on that bank. And that would be devastating for Turkey's economy right now. That was actually, we hear from some sources, one of the deals that might have been on the table. Because there had been an arrangement to get Pastor Brunson released. It fell through. And we think that one of the reasons that it did was that Turkey was asking for even perhaps no sanctions or no fines whatsoever. So I think its concerns are economic. I think it doesn't want a fine on its banks. I think it doesn't want the U.S. to move forward with its suspension of the F-35 jet delivery. Turkey is part of a consortium of the production of these F-35 jets. And if you have an S-400 missile defense system of Russia on your territory and you have these brand new jets made by U.S., there's an intelligence compromise possibility there. So that's one of the concerns. So I think we can kind of encapsulate all that with economic concerns at this point. It's not about reassuring the U.S. It's not about trying to mend the relationship. This is not a détente or a rapprochement. It's nothing like that. Erdogan is extraordinarily transactional. And just because he conceded something at one point doesn't mean he'll do so in the future.
So I want to zoom out and bring in Professor Duran a bit, because all this comes at a time when the U.S. wants to keep focused on Iran, right? And so here you have the NATO partner, Turkey, it's very difficult to deal with. You have the Saudis killing a columnist in their consulate in Istanbul. And the administration wants to keep focused on Iran. Michael Mandelbaum was just talking about this kind of big picture of trying the deterrence and containment of China, Iran, and Russia. How do you do this when you have such difficult partners in the region, such difficult crises in all of these countries?
Well, you said that we would now turn to the broader picture.
Yeah.
And that really, in my case, means a very broad picture. It means modern history. And what I'd like to do is to take, to start where Michael Mandelbaum made a set of observations. He said, if the world were democratic in the sense that China, Russia, and Iran were democratic, then we'd have a peaceful world. And he liked very much the democratic peace theory, which is in many respects quite impressive. The problem is that none of that is likely. In fact, I'd say impossible at this point. So I start from what I would regard as a bit more realist of a position, and that is as follows. I too am working on a book. The title of mine is World Order in the 21st Century. You can't get much broader than that. And it's based on a lot of work over many years, asking what in fact affects the probability of major war, particularly in terms of structural change. We look at the changing relative power of the great powers, and we see that they tend to follow a kind of cycle, if you will, a rise and decline. But it's much more interesting than that because it's a cycle which has certain points of radical structural change associated with it. And it's this radical structural change, we argue, in power terms, that causes difficulties for world order. Now, I'll give you one example quickly. One example is Germany. On this cycle, there's a lower turning point, then there's a kind of an inflection, what we call an inflection point. What is that? It's very simple. It's just that where the momentum changes, where the state has continued to rise in terms of relative power, but the rate of increase is falling off suddenly and abruptly. And then, of course, the top of the cycle, and then there's on the other side, there's another inflection point, and of course, potentially another one at the bottom. And at each of these points, there's a great probability of instability associated with that government and with and for other governments trying to deal with that government. Now, the example I was going to give you was Germany. Prior to the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, Germany had just gone through its first inflection point. It was starting to slow down in terms of its growth rate. In 1914, the Germans already understood that they were beginning to enter relative decline. And they weren't wrong about this. They were exactly correct. It's just the only thing that they were wrong about is the response that they chose. And then, of course, in the mid-1930s, Germany had gone through its second inflection point, which means that it's like a second wind. You're running in track and you suddenly get a second wind, you feel better. Well, that in fact drove Nazism, supported Nazism. And Hitler, however mad he was, and he certainly was mad, understood power very well. And he knew that Germany was in this relative decline position. Now, where are we today? Well, very quickly, first of all, Russia, after 1990, plummeted, of course, in terms of its relative power. But in fact, unlike what a lot of people say, I think Russia is trying to climb out of this situation, trying to once again climb up its power cycle. I don't think it'll be very successful because its economy is so dreadful, but it has huge resources and a huge military, the only other second strike nuclear capability in the system other than our own. I think, I'm not surprised that there were the three efforts at military challenge, one in Georgia, which we handled, I would say, because we had a Secretary of Defense who was extraordinarily able. I'd love to talk about that as a case study, but, and then not so successful with regard to the Crimea, and finally with Ukraine. I'm not surprised that the Russians are doing this because this is a highly unstable period as a state is trying to move up the cycle again. Secondly, the other great power that has gone through great structural change is Japan. You know, remember, some of you may remember, in the 1990s, there were people writing about the fact that Japan was supposed to be the next superpower. It was going to replace the United States. Well, none of that happened. The analysis we did expressly in published form said this would not happen. And of course, now Japan is in what I would consider to be nascent relative decline, past its peak in terms of its relative power. So that is a very difficult experience for Japan. But for the alliance with the United States, it would be, I think, a lot more traumatic. But the most interesting example, the most interesting case is China. China has, as was said earlier, expressed to the world what it could do in 4 decades, a remarkable kind of transformation of its economy. And if you talk to PLA people and just others, even students from China, there's almost a universal sort of assumption that China is going to continue up this path of very rapid rise with the objective, obviously, of replacing the United States. They don't even conceal that as an objective. Now, what our data show is that unfortunately for China, it's gone through its first inflection point. It is now slowing down in terms of the rate of increase. It's still increasing in terms of relative power, but the rate of increase is slowing down. And this we have shown from other data for the whole period, 200-year period, is an extremely difficult experience for a government. So the conclusion that we come to is that we have 3 states that are going through these critical points of radical instability with huge political uncertainty that follows from this. Unfortunately, history shows that that means that the probability of major war increases. Doesn't mean that major war is inevitable, and I certainly wouldn't claim that, but it has increased relative to earlier periods of the 20th century, and this is a point where the greatest skill and statecraft will be necessary to maintain stability.
Whose statecraft?
Yours, ours, theirs, everybody's, ours, American.
But this is also a time when there's, our partners in Europe are in crisis over, the future institutions. I want to bring in you, Matthias, to talk us through a little bit about what's happening to the European model. We were all heading in the right direction. I mean, I was a Soviet studies major. Well, by the time I ended, it was Russian and Eastern European studies. But it was, it was the end of history, right? And it was this whole Europe coming together and being as one. Now you have, nationalists in Hungary. You have the Turks having their own crisis, and you have Brexit. You're focusing kind of on Brexit, so I wonder if you can just, the French president this week said this is not a technical issue that can be resolved, this is a British political problem. Is there any way that ends well, that this ends well, the UK getting out of the EU?
Wow. Thank you for that question. I was just reminded that at SAIS in 2008, I defended my PhD dissertation, and it was called The Political Economy of Crisis Making, the United Kingdom from Attlee to Blair. And it was really mostly focused on kind of like, how politicians use and abuse situations to kind of narrate certain crises that may not even be there, to kind of push through their ideas. And so I never thought that I'd see a case study 10 years down the line as well as this one. But I think there's a lot of blame to go around on the British side for this, right? I mean, this is kind of a perfect case study in anything that could be wrong about today's democracies, but also many of the things that could be right. I mean, today saw close to 700,000 people protest in London. for what they call a people's vote, for a second referendum that would decide Britain's fate, which they all argue should include an option for them to actually remain in the European Union. But that reminds me a little bit of the Greek summer of 2015, where they were also voting in a referendum on something that was no longer on offer, right? I mean, they were voting on bailout terms that the EU had perfectly said they no longer apply, right? And then, of course, they voted no, and then they got even worse bailout terms. So it is a little hard, even though I'm sympathetic to, and of course, I mean, most of us in this room will know the people that were protesting today and be much more kind of aligned in our thinking with this. But I mean, they did vote in 2016, and they voted 48% to leave, even though it wasn't quite clear they even knew what they were voting for, right? I mean, that is, to me, if you see now these videos of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage saying nobody's talking about leaving the single market, right? I mean, why would we want to leave the single market? I mean, Norway and Switzerland, I mean, they're perfectly happy. And then a year later, they're saying, well, if we don't leave the single market, what's the whole point? We were about taking back control. And so there's, in many ways, there was so much misinformation during the campaign on the Leave side, but on the Remain side, I mean, you can't expect a political establishment for 40 years saying how dreadful everything about the EU is, and then to suddenly turn around in the last 3 months before a vote and say, actually, it's all great, and you should vote for it. So that's where we are. But I do think there is a broader kind of European Union problem there. And the big debate, and not to bore you with scholarly debates, but one of the big scholarly debates in European Union studies right now is on differentiation. So the idea that there could be multiple speeds, there could be variable geometry, that there could be outer circles and inner circles, and so on. And I mean, that's probably where we're going, and that's probably where many people think the EU is going. But it's a little bit disingenuous, this debate, I think, because at the end of the day, once you are a member of the single market, and once you are a member of the Eurozone, there seems to be a remarkable little differentiation that's possible, right? I think what Europe created between the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s is actually a system with much more central authority in many ways than even the United States has. And I think many people don't quite realize this, right? And I think we saw this during the negotiations with Greece over in the summer over their third bailout, where it was clearly obvious that here the Greeks had elected a new government, Syriza, that had run on a radically different program. They had a popular mandate to end all this stuff. And then it was perfectly clear that, I mean, as you saw the negotiations from January to July, that Tsipras and Syriza and Greece had to cave all the way. And I do think you see this play out now with the Brits as well, right? I mean, again, the vote was much misguided, but it seems to me within the single market, there is very little possibility to differentiate, right? You can't control immigration. You can't even, control many of the things that US states can, right? So I've been working on a project with a colleague from University of Oregon, and it's actually quite remarkable how United States, federal states, have quite a bit more flexibility to differentiate from other states than you have within the European Union, where they're sovereign states. So I'll give you just a couple of examples, and I think that's where some of these issues come in. So right now, if you remember the Eurozone, and that's of course what's playing out, many of you have been to Bologna, what's playing out in the Italian case, is the Italians have now to submit a budget to the European Commission, which the European Commission can veto. And they can throw it back to Rome, and then Rome has to redo their homework, send it back before they even debate it in their national legislature. But just imagine for a moment that Massachusetts or Texas or California would have to send their budget for next year to a federal bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., not elected, not anything, who can say, actually, we don't like this, start over. Secondly is public procurement, right? I mean, any state in the United States, even cities, can discriminate very happily. If San Francisco wants to build a new bridge, they can give this to California building companies, right? They can discriminate for them. And that's something that's, for example, not possible within the European Union. It has to be completely opened up to the rest of the EU. Of course, in practice, I mean, this not necessarily always happen, but it does seem the case, and you see this now, of course, in Hungary and in Poland as well with the rule of law. There's not much possibility. I mean, of course, that's a completely different story, but they want to diverge on certain issues which they feel that democracy, right, people's vote have empowered them to do, but they now feel constrained by the European Union to do so. So I think what's changed since the lofty ideals from the early 90s is that the reality of enlargement, I think especially, has made the European Union so much more heterogeneous, right? Where suddenly free movement of labor, free movement of people has become politicized. I mean, inevitably, because here you have, unsurprisingly, you know, actually, if you look at Romania, has lost 3-4 million people since enlargement, right? And many of them moved to Spain and Italy. Poland has lost 2-3 million people. And more sinister for democracy, I think, and that's, I think, one of the kind of bad consequences of lofty ideals, as the European Union was one. Hungary has gone from 11 to 10 million people since Orban's re-election in 2010. And these are young, educated, progressive, intelligentsia who now live in Berlin or in Vienna or in London, right? It's become very hard for them to vote because you can only vote in the embassy physically on the day of the election. And it does mean that not only there's been a kind of, you know, remember exit, voice, and loyalty, Hirschman, and so they've exited the country, but they no longer have voice. And actually that also means that the natural opposition for someone like Orban, I guess people like you and me, right, have left because they've just given up on the country. And so what you see now in Hungary, to a lesser extent in Poland, is that the EU, thanks to its exit option that it makes available to many citizens, has actually strengthened these autocratic tendencies in these countries. And that's something I think that the EU has to keep in mind as they talk about enlargement towards these smaller Balkans countries, Montenegro and so on, where you could have these things on steroids if there's free movement.
But you also have Russia. I mean, I was always amazed, you know, I'm amazed when I'm hearing here in the U.S. when people talk about the Soros-funded opposition people, because that's the language I used to hear in Eastern Europe because the Russians hated George Soros. You know, you have a president here talking about these things too. How does U.S., I don't know, Trumpism or whatever playing into what's happening in Europe?
I'm gonna get Lisa to answer.
So sure, they always pass it to the woman, don't they? No. Well, I do actually study psychology and foreign policy, but I would take a different approach to this because I see this, and I comment often that I never thought that all of the tools that I learn about what I kind of call the authoritarian handbook or the dictator's handbook. There's a number of actual academic texts published along these lines, but you know, a lot of what we're seeing is being taken from the, you know, Erdogan takes from Putin's handbook and Trump takes from Erdogan's handbook. And first you delegitimize the media and you say that, you know, you can't trust these sources. You know, obviously the populism that we're seeing in Poland and in Hungary and certainly in Turkey, narratives of fear, narratives of anti-establishmentism, narratives of drain the swamp. You know, we're seeing a lot of that as well. The rhetorical vilification of particular groups, whether it's by dog whistle and sort of, you know, not explicitly calling out groups, but you know who they're referring to. So much of that I see. And I never thought I would learn or apply the tools from that authoritarian handbook that I kind of inductively derived from Turkey in the United States. And I'm seeing quite a lot of them. And one that particularly got my mind got my attention is precisely what you mentioned. And I think I tweeted something like, you know, the protesters after the Kavanaugh hearing were supposedly paid protesters. And that narrative is such a sad one. And so unbelievable, I think, or was unbelievable to a lot of people. And even, you know, when it's used in Turkey, not a lot of people believe it, but they go along with it. And the fact that that's being employed here is really frightening to me.
By the way, I remember covering pro-Putin rallies where they did bus in people. So
Yeah.
those are the ones, those are the paid ones.
Yeah.
Professor Duran, you wrote to me that you studied American history as an undergraduate and looked at populist movements in the U.S. Is that what this is?
I also said I studied
And chemistry. Yeah.
And that's how you become a professor at SAIS.
I studied theater.
Anyway, I guess what I would say is this. You could ask, why, this is populism. What do we learn from American history in this regard? Everybody seems to look at Jackson because he's an interesting character, in some ways as interesting a character as Trump is. But I think they were very different and from very different parts of the world, the country. So I think that's overworked. But what we should do is look at the progressivism of the 1890s. And I recommend, if you want to look at a book that still is terribly, wonderfully readable, read the book by Richard Hofstadter called The Age of Reform. It's just a marvelous book. And what you see a lot of similarities between that period and this period. There are negative sides of populism, of course. Unfortunately, this was in the 1890s was a rural-based kind of populism, and it was tended to be white, male, and they didn't like Catholics, they didn't like Jews, they didn't like blacks. Other than that, they were pretty nice people, and. They, in fact, had crazy ideas about the reform of the monetary system. They were talking about a system that would just be on silver, and they also thought it'd be good to just stabilize the interest rates and not let them fluctuate. So they had lots of ideas that were strange. On the other hand, this was also a great age of reform. This was in 1890. There was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which turned out to be extremely important in terms of dynamizing the economy, getting the economy, making it more competitive. And following progressivism, following populism, was progressivism. Now, progressivism was well known for its reforms, continuing some of the better ones of the populists. One of the radical ideas they had was to give women the right to vote. So, reforms can flow out of these kinds of things because the populists are not following any script. They're pragmatic, and they're open to, they want to see change, and they have constituents who are demanding some kind of action. So they try, in fact, to provide that, or at least to discuss them. Now, you have to sort out the good ideas from the bad ideas. What is remarkable to me is I haven't seen any reforms really out of this administration. So that's where I would stop. I'd say when will the reforms, real proposals for reform take place, and what will they be like?
It seems mostly for show at the moment. I want to open it up because we don't have a whole lot more time, and I know lots of questions way, way in the back. Do we have a microphone somewhere? You want to just stand up and shout? Yeah, I got it. Oh, way back there.
The woman who is the expert on Turkey, I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses. You are brilliant. I absolutely love you talking about Turkey.
Thank you.
It's so important right now. And one of the questions I find too interesting that he's so anti-journalist and somehow there's illegal information.
Yeah.
So is Turkey a proxy for other states? Is it an actor for perhaps another state in doing this? And in particular, because of the strategic implications of the wedge between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, what are the implications in particular for Russia and Iran?
So I think that's a really smart question in the sense that exactly what Turkey is doing right now, in the sense that I said it's trying to unhinge itself from previous ties, it's trying to carve its own independent niche, I think is Turkey's, under this particular government's, first of all, this government has a different understanding of what it means to be Turkish, both in terms of domestic policy, who we are in the domestic arena, as well as who our allies and enemies should be. Than did, say, previous, what I call in my research, Republican nationalist governments that were, very much secularist, tied to European ideals, had notions of gender equality, and wanted to be rooted in this transatlantic relationship. The current government, in my book, I call having an Ottoman Islamist understanding of identity that has very different implications for domestic politics as well as for foreign policy. And I think trying to carve out this niche is not necessarily to, it's not an irredentist, neo-imperial sort of it's not that they want to take territory back, but they want influence, and they want not to be a place of contestation over other great power interests. They want to activate their agency and not just kind of be tied to what the U.S. wants. I mean, if you saw it like in Cyprus in 1974, that was other than the point we have right now, which I think is an absolute nadir in U.S.-Turkey relations. 1974 would have been the other instance of that, where the U.S. actually placed economic sanctions on Turkey for invading Cyprus. And as they saw it, that was them protecting their own people. And so they're sick of having to not necessarily be a proxy, but rather, be tied to the interests of others. That being said, Turkey's very much exploring its other strategic possibilities in the region, in terms of Iran, in terms of Russia, in terms of China, and in terms of Qatar. Russia has been extremely important for Turkey in terms of what it wanted to do in Syria. In terms of any action that Turkey could take with the operations, the military operations that it undertook to try and clear what they were afraid of as a Kurdish corridor, or what they call the terrorist corridor, was with Russian permission. That wouldn't have happened without Russian permission, or without collaboration with formerly Al-Qaeda linked al-Nusra, now HTS, right? So they play a lot of different sides here. They're much more willing to cooperate with Iran. They have said explicitly they will not adhere to the current U.S. sanctions on Iran. We know that they have sort of secretly circumvented them in the past, looking for Chinese investment. So I would say maybe not, that they're stopping being a proxy, but rather they're trying to assert their own agency. But one of the problems is that in doing so, it has created such a web of complex relations that it's sort of not having stable relations with anyone, and having the only firm ally that Turkey has in the region is Qatar. Not to discount Qatar, because it has provided quite a lot of economic aid, but it is very much complicated, its relations in the region, particularly in trying to do exactly what you're saying.
There was a question up front here, right? Yeah.
Yes. I would like to add to the mix. I'm really struggling with the impact of social media and the fragmentation of news sources. When I was a certain period, there was water cronkite, and you got them, everybody was
Right.
to the national news. Now you can pick out your own news source,
Yeah.
your radio commentator. You live in a world where everything you believe is reinforced. But also then these stories spread so rapidly, not just in the United States. I'm just reading in Brazil, there's a big disinformation campaign going on. And it's a struggle. How do we deal with this? I don't know.
I wish
it's
I
like a
knew.
minor-
I wish I knew.
Well, there you go.
No, I can't answer that. I don't.
I deal with it, but we really have to struggle with this form of communication that is turning things topsy-turvy a little bit.
I'll respond to anything, so I will try, I'll respond to this. I have to say that I think this is the first president who really understood what you're talking about and used it tremendously to his advantage. I mean, he's not just a careless person tweeting. He, in fact, uses this with extreme calculation and, in fact, leads the press. And the press just follows along behind the regular media, follows right along.
That's a
Now,
big problem.
the good part of that is that they sell lots of newspapers and so on because of this. But the bad part is that they're not taking the lead. They're having to respond, or as they see it, they have to set the record straight. This is an extraordinary amount of power that a president has to, if they use it in the way that Trump has, to influence public opinion and to really, in a sense, I don't like to use the term, but sort of neutralize the press.
Maybe just as a bit of a SAIS legacy answer. So we have the David Kaleo speaker series, Distinguished Speaker Series, that Matthias has also been very active in helping to organize, and I'm organizing the moderators for this term, I guess. We have Nia Jankovic coming next Tuesday, who's a Wilson Center fellow who works on disinformation of Russia in Central and Eastern Europe. So we're trying to bring those perspectives here, so I'm glad you raised that.
No, I mean, I was in Moscow when Putin came to power, so I watched, you had independent television, and, little by little, he whittled it away, and it was all state television by the time I left. Television here, I mean, I think when I started in journalism, I could go do a story and come back and think about it for a day and write the story. This was before social media, before Twitter and everything, and I think it's changed everything. It's a good resource for us as journalists because we can't be everywhere, and there are activists who once you know them and you can trust them, you can get information from them, but information spreads way too fast now, and people don't have the time, and especially television. I mean, you watch the TV, and there's no reporters anymore. It's all analysts, right? It's not reported pieces, talking to several different people, and packages. There are those, and the newspapers do that. But most of the time on television, I flip back and forth between Fox and CNN and MSNBC, and it's just,
Yeah, but there's another change.
it's just talking heads spreading more of these things that they hear, and that you don't hear kind of sit back. It was okay. NPR was always we always joked that we were like a day late, but at least it was thorough. But, we got away with it then, and I don't think it's harder and harder to get away with
If I
that.
could make an observation, I remember the days when CNN was just starting. They had over there in Georgetown, they had a place, and they had a little table, a little pedestal in the middle of the room, and there were people all walking around, and there were a couple of cameras, and you were supposed to climb up on this thing. There was 2 chairs. And you were interviewed in the middle of all this chaos. This was really casual stuff. But they actually brought in people they thought were experts to talk about this. That has disappeared. Now it's journalists talking to journalists. They may not be they may not be reporters in the way that you say, but they are clearly not. They're not people who, from whatever background, have a sort of an understanding that might be useful to be shared. Otherwise, it's just journalists talking to journalists.
Or former
And
spokespeople.
Whatever recently has come up, it's repeated. Now, I don't know why that change has taken place. Is it because the experts were uninteresting and people didn't want to hear them? Is it they were too expensive? It was too difficult to do this? What happened in the media, on television especially, to change this?
Matthias wanted to say
Yeah,
something.
I mean, I guess what we don't know yet is how much this has transformed things, right? I mean, would the Brexit vote not have happened? I mean, did it reinforce polarization? Absolutely, right? But, I mean, it's still an interesting question to ask about those 300,000-400,000 white males in these 5 states. Why did they flip from Obama to Trump, right? I mean, would they have done so without social media? My guess is they probably would have. So I think there's deeper causes that social media is just a medium for this. But that on the media, and not to put Michelle on the spot, I'll just focus on BBC. But BBC has had tremendous criticism, I think rightly so, for this kind of obsession that they seem to have with being even-handed in the Brexit debate, right? So, well, so the Remainers say this, and then the Brexiteers say this. I mean, but it's not equivalent, right? I mean, some are using facts or real predictions, even though, predictions are usually wrong, especially economic ones, right? But I think that is what a lot of people are frustrated with, and I think people like us and like you, universities graduated from here. I mean, we should worry about this, right? I mean, and so it has kind of put an additional burden on journalists now to kind of, say, well, actually, that's a lie. Actually, that's not true. And I think that is what we're struggling with now.
Yeah, the false equivalency. All right, back there.
So I have a question. So it's, thank you. I'd like to say I'm a SAIS student, but I'm actually here for my 25th reunion.
You're a young man.
It seems to me that one of the answers to the question of today's panel is sort of divides in society, right? I mean, I'm fully on board with the media being a big issue, unaddressed. But whether it's divides according to economic sort of outlook, embracing technology and change, comfort with disruption, that's inevitable, that's coming down the road, regardless of where you live. Contact with people within your own country, much less beyond. That's very true in the U.S. It's certainly true around the world. And so I guess I would, if we accept some of those divides and some of those schisms that are also a threat to democracy, and feel free to challenge, but I guess I would say, what is a place, I'm sorry to put the question in such a way, but how is SAIS, or what is the role of sort of elite institutions in trying to actively address that? And if you look at the new president of Harvard, for example, he has explicitly stated he wants to try to connect beyond Cambridge and has developed relationships in Ohio, Michigan, and so on, which I think is a great thing. Is it appropriate for academia to be, in a place like SAIS, to try to be more prescriptive and have some of that reaching out? In other words, I really appreciate the analysis now, but can we afford to just leave it at that?
I can answer real quick. I mean, from what university can do in student recruitment, right, and even faculty recruitment. So, I mean, I think, as many of you know, in the last 10 years, there's been a big push to increase diversity in universities, right? And I think we've done quite a good job at SAIS when it comes to our student body, and especially even when it comes to hiring junior faculty and so on. And I think the problem in elite universities still, though, today, is a little bit that we kind of favoring certain types of diversity over, I think it usually goes at the cost of socioeconomic diversity, right? When I teach a political economy seminar and you talk about income inequality, there are all kinds of colors and sexual orientations in my room, but they usually come from very privileged economically backgrounds, right? And so that is hard for a place like SAIS, right? Because we're a graduate school. I mean, if I'm a poor kid from Ohio, I probably want to get an MBA, right? I mean, or I want to go to medical school or do law school if I'm so gifted, right? So our proposition to master students, I mean, that's, I think, are parts of the, especially U.S. population now, that we could do a much better job at reaching. But, you know, as you may know, tuition is a lot higher today than it was 25 years ago, right? And it's not quite clear that it immediately pays off in different jobs. But I think we are moving in this direction, as long as we're aware that diversity is not just the way you look, right, or something like that. What about political diversity, Charles? You want to answer that?
Why do you look at me? I'm the authority. I was going to say this. Right opposite my office, we have a wonderful seminar that's always packed with people on journalism and the media in international politics, led by Mike Mosetic, who is very well known in terms of, I think he won 2 Emmys, whatever that is, I don't know, but I said it's not nice, and he said, yeah, it's good to put on your dresser or something to have them. He's outstanding, and he attracts students from everywhere, including a lot of people with a military background who are interested in this interaction between the military and the way it's being treated in the press and so on. So I think SAIS is trying, in terms of the media, to do something at a really, in my judgment, a high level. Now, as far as the other questions of diversity are concerned, I guess what I would do is agree with my colleague. Because I think it's a challenge to bring people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. We want to do that. No, how about just poor? They don't have a lot of money. It's hard to bring them into the program. Unless you have huge amounts of scholarship aid, which we don't have. So that's a big challenge for us. I'd be interested to hear some recommendations of what we should do, assuming that that's something that we want, that we don't just want to have people of a certain kind of socioeconomic background in the school.
We had a couple hands up over here, so.
Gary Loberg, 2008, and I'm one of the military guys that you talked about, one of the poor kids from Ohio that you talked about who did this and then went got an MBA. So taking all of those blocks, all of what you're talking about is increasing diversity here, diversity of thought here, but the question you asked was how do you get that message back to the rest of the country? Because whether I go to a talk at Brookings or I'm down at AEI or I'm up in New York, we are all talking to ourselves. So the bigger challenge, I mean, it's interesting to bring folks in and how do you help the poor student who wants to expand their mind and see a broader policy realm. But other than them talking to their parents, who are they talking to back there? I don't go back to Ohio, right? And as a uniform guy, I'll tell you, nobody else out there understands that world. So who's going back to share that perspective that they're gaining through the cross-culturalism here?
Well, I guess the hope is that the people that graduate from here go and work for the Treasury and change the tax code and work
And
at the
the
Federal
education
Reserve and
system.
create broad-based economic growth so that, but yeah, I don't know. Do we have a good answer for this?
Well, how could SAIS do it, or how could media do it?
I think it's the identification of the challenge itself, right?
Yeah.
They're doing outreach via social media out of Boston, and that's good. That's part of it, but it's how do you gain an actual dialogue and an exchange, given the point you made of we're all listening to our own sources.
I think the most scary statistic I've read of the future of this country, that by 2040, 70% of Americans are going to live in 15 states, and 30% are going to live in 35 states. And you know that latter 30% and those 35 states, what they are, right? I mean, these are whiter, older, more male, more straight kind of populations. And I think the only hope we have is that house prices become so high in the coasts that everybody starts moving their families back in flyover
The water
countries.
keeps rising so much that California falls into the ocean.
And then automatically, I think you'll get-
Policy-wise, we're on track for that. So. Yeah.
And there's, refugees that move from other countries that do settle in those communities, and that has been.
Can I answer my own question? I know there's other people.
Yeah.
We need to
Building
go
on what you
quiz.
said, 25 years ago, I went, and probably other people here did, on what would be called a junket to 29 Palms Air Force, Marine Base.
Yeah.
Marine Corps Base. I had an exposure to the military that is one of the few I've ever had, up close and personal. It was life-changing, and it gave me so much respect for the military, which I never would have had. So find someone who can put up, I don't know, 25,000, 50,000 bucks, whatever it would be to fly 25, 30, 50 SAIS students, whatever it is, to Ohio, or to Nebraska, or to wherever, to try to bridge it. Sorry, I'm looking at you, you don't work here.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, I guess my point is, I feel it's more and more incumbent on institutions such as SAIS to be a little bit more activist and a little bit more making those connections, and not just be, dare I say, in the Ivy Tower.
Yeah,
Running out of time.
I'd just like to respond to
Yeah.
that. I have to say that SAIS does a good job on this, although the term junket was mentioned. And some of us say, well, how expensive is this trip going to be? And more than that, since I've had something to do with Canadian studies for a long time, and we set up these kinds of things before it was as fashionable as it is now. We have many, many of these trips out. But what we tried to do was to somehow wrangle a few minutes with the opposition leader, for example. Not easy to do. In other words, you have to really talk to people who are in policy positions, because our students were able to respond at that level. But you build up an expectation. It's hard to do this. Now, we reach out. We go all over the world. We have at the break in January. There's no one here. They're all out doing something someplace else. It's not unique to SAIS. All our competitors are doing the same thing. The only thing I would say, and I'm a little bit of a skeptic here, I would say, let's make sure that they're not just, absorbing the sunshine someplace, but that they are really meeting people who are deeply involved in policy, who may have very different views, so that they can, in fact, get a perspective that's quite different, and so that those people can get a perspective that's different. Just to follow up the Canadian example, we've done some interactions with people in Edmonton and in Calgary. And unfortunately, I had some friends there, and so the lawyers set up a meeting with 5 or 6 CEOs from small energy companies, and we had a dialogue. And we knew we were being tested, we were being used. They didn't want to hear me. They wanted to hear what the students thought about these kinds of questions that they were having to deal with. So there's some outreach there that works. But it takes a lot of effort and time to set these things up. And it does take some resources. And one has to be very careful that they aren't junkets.
All right, over here.
All right, so Chris Meyer, 08, we did do that too in our class. We went down to Quantico, so it's a good, hopefully, thing that can continue to happen. But Matthias, maybe Liesl, you talked about, or at least Matthias, the EU, not a lot of democracy, you might say, in the sense of the EU project. Is there a move or a push to decentralize more power and decisions, or is anybody making that, thinking about that and change maybe to save things? I guess the differentiation, or is it double down and keep things centralized?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we're in this moment in Europe where there's no elite consensus, right? I mean, when Europe made the Single European Act, Maastricht, and enlargement decisions, 85, 95, I mean, in hindsight, that was kind of an extraordinary period of consensus, right? I mean, when it came all the way down from independent central banks to democracy to, I mean, what Michel started with, right? Right now you see, I mean, the British elite have a fundamentally different view. The Italian current government basically want to go back to a pre-1992 world where they have fixed exchange rate that they can devalue again. And I guess everybody puts their hope on Emmanuel Macron in France, who kind of wants to move beyond this kind of more narrow German rules-based vision of Europe, where there's more discretion at the EU level. But that requires, as you hint, more democracy at the EU level, right? And I think what's painfully clear every time there's crises is that countries are divided. I mean, they think along national lines, right? So as long as you don't have a kind of European demos, I think this is very hard to do, right? I mean, the elections coming up in the spring, in May 2019, and every 5 years now, it's like the elections of the last chance for Europe, right? I mean, you're probably going to see a kind of quite a big mixed bag, right? Quite some rise in Eurosceptic views that want much less Europe, and then probably I expect Macron's party to do quite well, and maybe others as well. So yeah, Europe itself suffers from this polarization. So I guess I also don't think it's particularly desirable, right? That Europe moves further in this direction. I mean, there are certain things like climate change and so on that they should be doing together, but I still fail to see how it's useful for bureaucrats to decide on pensions of particular countries if they have just different preferences, right? I think that is the kind of and in Europe, this is all turbocharged, right? I mean, some of these similar, and it always comes back to Danny Roderick's trilemma, right? Whether you can have two of the three, whether it's national sovereignty, democracy, or integration, globalization. And Europe has kind of given up some of its national sovereignty there, right? And so the hope would be that there'd be more democracy at the European level. But I just, right now it's hard to see, where that this is indeed where it's going to go.
Let Dan back there at the mic, then we'll go over.
I just want to say, first of all, there's 2 or 3 points that went around. One about scholarships. Before I get to anything else, I have to say, with all due respect to you, Matthias, when we were, this is class of 93, when we came in, incoming class had only 2 scholarships, 2 full scholarships. It has gone up a huge amount. For our second year, we had the 4 flash scholarships. So there's a huge amount of fundraising that went into effect when Wolfowitz came in, and then I don't think Jessica Einhorn did much after that. So I'll be quite honest about that. This is, as much as people hated Wolfowitz in terms of his policies, he did do a huge amount for fundraising. Before that, Dean Packard only raised for Japan studies. So unless you were doing Japan studies, that was it. You remember, Professor Duran. So let's be real about that in terms of scholarships. One, I personally am a migrant from Iran. I was taught that you just study math or sciences or medicine or law, as you said. And, you know, for people who come, and I did study maths and sciences and then came to SAIS, and I had to, you know, I took a full amount of the full, loans. And you have to show, you have to be able to pay those back at the end, and that's I think one of the issues. That being said, the other thing you said, by the way, I worked both at Treasury and at the Fed. We don't set taxes, we just implement them and enforce stuff, so just FYI. And the other thing is that at Treasury, basically SAIS owns Treasury, which is all the way up to the Secretary of Treasury. Now, and I worked at the Pentagon, and you guys did junkets. I worked and lived there 5 years and dated a guy from Ohio, so open my eyes. So
We're going to get a Dan's whole life story here.
Yeah, like just saying, you know, all these things you're saying is absolutely true, and I would like to say what Paul said is correct. And if you're, you know, one of the ways people at SAIS reach these audiences is going to, you know, PBS NewsHour, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, Ohio, there are, believe it or not, there are people who watch it, but, you know, there has to be some other more kind of outreach. But if you have panels and you speak, when you were talking about what happened to the exports, you know, I see this Washington Week, like religiously, and I watch, you know, a lot of these news, and you will see that you're right, that there are a lot of journalists who go, but because of this, how fast this news is, nobody's going to wait to see a professor think on TV. They're going to want, you know, quick answers to everything, and that's why journalists know what people are looking for, and they put together whatever they heard in the White House and wherever, and they're just, you know, giving you the answers. But you know, the outreach, I agree with Paul, it's correct, and it's true that there is a huge need by SAIS to get that, but at this day and age, my bigger question is, this day and age where there's a war on truth, you know, I mean, we were talking about, when we were talking about the reunion committee coming here, we were talking about how everything that we've learned at SAIS seems to be, you know, right now, at this point, you know, turning out to be not true, you know, from economics to, you know, we've never heard a sitting president saying to the head of the Fed that you're wrong, you shouldn't do this. I mean, these things we haven't seen. There are things that we've never experienced, and we hope we never will, but, you know, how do you address that too, in addition to what Paul very correctly said?
Yeah.
I am admittedly not considered to be a great expert on democracy. It's not one of my fields. But like everybody else, I'm deeply interested in it and worried about any challenges to it. And I have to say, the stronger the institutions a country has, the better the legal foundation, the greater the division of power so that there can be constraints on executives, the more vigorous can be your discussion, including discussion from the head of the government. So when people say that they're worried about American democracy and so on, I'm not among them. I have great confidence in the strength of the institutions here, of the notion of a balance of power across the divisions of government, the role of the press. I think it's the free press is the cornerstone of democracy, and in every democracy, not just this one. And the press, despite the negative things we've said, the press is doing a superb job, I think, of trying to get a message across that is factual and oftentimes is challenging. So I'm not worried about American democracy. I think that we are seeing some stresses and strains, some different ways of doing things, but we're going to do all right. We're going to come out on the positive side.
Hope so.
I'm
Got
worried.
one up here, and we got to wrap up soon, so.
I'm Joe McBride from 68. I'd like to take it away from studying our own belly button, if you will, to a much larger issue as far as I'm concerned. At the end of my career, I look overseas, and I think the biggest trend that's happening that nobody has addressed at all here is that people in the third world are figuring out it's better over there, and they're moving. They're moving to Europe. They'll probably be replacing those bright, young, intellectual wannabes in Eastern Europe who've moved over to Paris. They're moving in Latin America. And one doesn't have to be a fanatic about the wall to say, how are our systems, how are our political systems going to deal with what I think will be a fundamental challenge? Not a threat, but a challenge.
Why don't you take that one? and
Yeah,
you can respond to it.
it's an excellent question. I mean, I don't think they're going to be moving to Hungary because Orban won't let them in. But I do think immigration is one of these issues that is where the polarization is very unhelpful, right? And I feel that's even the case within the European context, where there's this kind of blanket commitment to free movement of labor, which, again, that's all fine for highly trained people who move between capital cities. It's much more problematic if you suddenly get, a bunch of people moving in a small town, right? Which then puts pressure on the local schools and so on. So I think that's one of those things where I mean, most countries have their own systems in place and they manage these things, right? I mean, let's not forget that when it comes to illegal immigration in this country, that wonderful term, I mean, the previous administration did just as much, if not more, in kind of sending them back and so on. So I think even the most progressive administrations have been the rhetoric is very different from the reality of their actions, right? But yeah, the hope is that many of these countries economic growth will really take off. And so what the interesting thing is, I think, if you actually look at the statistics, I mean, you're right, more people want to migrate than actually are, right? But it's only about 7% globally, if you can trust these latest statistics, that want to move. And about, I think, 3% that has, or something like this, right? So the kind of predictions of these mass flows of immigration, I mean, in general, even within the United States, I mean, the average distance an American lives from their mother is 23 miles. And so most people actually don't really move. I mean, people like in this room are kind of exceptions to this, it seems to me.
20 miles.
I'm also about that, so.
I think it's really important to mention in the areas in which you do see, and I can't help but relate everything to Turkey because it's in my mind all the time, but the areas in which you do see the so-called pushback against immigration and perhaps strains on capacity is often when you have something like a refugee crisis. And so, Turkey has at this point about 4 million Syrian refugees alone, not to mention Pakistani, Afghani, Iranian, and so forth. But, in terms of the kind of migration patterns that Matthias is talking about, you're not seeing, those kinds of huge overflows. And I think that to even conceptualize those in kind of dehumanizing terms, if I may, is a bit concerning. And I do think that when you look at statistics about economic growth and development and the contribution that immigrants make, I think that we tend to concern ourselves with the burden that they're going to place on societies as opposed to the contributions that they can make.
But climate change also could be a much bigger driver. Yeah, I mean, you were talking about economic reasons, but there could be.
No, I mean, that's a global problem in itself. You have what are actually climate change refugees at this point in Nauru, right? And so it's not just the U.S. who's concerned with that as well. But yeah, just in general, in terms of the kind of patterns that we see, those aren't, even the climate change migratory patterns aren't sort of sudden, overwhelming catastrophe, how do we deal with this, but rather something that's a bit slower in motion.
There was somebody back in here, no? Are we all done? Because we're actually, up against time, so if that's good, then we can wrap it up. But is there anyone else that has any other questions? Yeah?
I'd like to ask Matthias whether he thinks there's much of a chance for a second vote on Brexit.
I mean, in the end, there was no agreement in the last summit, because if there had been an agreement, the 10 Democratic Unionist Party members of Northern Ireland would have voted it down and the government would have fallen, right? So, I mean, they're playing there's a very cynical game going on the British government side, is that they know that they basically need to get it, and we all know what the deal is going to look like, right? I mean, 90% has been agreed, and that's so on money and on citizens there's been agreement. It's all about Northern Ireland now, about the backstop. And I think what you'll see in the next 6-7 weeks, if I were Northern Irish, I would push for this, because this is like having your cake and eating it, right? If Northern Ireland can indeed stay in the single market, but also be fully in the UK, then Belfast is the new London, right? Because then they should have the new hub of all. I mean, that's what I would say if I were Northern Irish, right? Of course, the DUP is especially, the most important thing for them is unity. So that's going to be the backstop. It's the only way, right? And they'll say, well, we'll never need it because we'll have a Canada Plus sort of deal. So they'll agree this, I think, in mid-December, right? Right before Christmas, they have a quick debate in House of Commons. Everybody goes home, Boxing Day and all that. And then they'll all come back January 7, and then there'll be so much pressure to vote for this, because the prospect of no deal, and there's not going to be enough time for a referendum, and then they're never going to agree on what kind of referendum. And that's what I think should be your baseline scenario, but I give that 60%. I don't give it much more, right? I mean, 40% is indeed that it all falls apart. And then I think, if there is no deal, I think the pressure for a new vote are going to be enormous. But the problem there again is, you're again going to play this game like you did in 2016, based on misinformation. And you're again are not going to really know what you're voting for, because the future relationship is yet to be agreed. Right? And so that is the kind of crazy part of this kind of direct democracy that everybody's playing. So, I mean, in the end of the day, anybody from continental Europe, myself included, always said, I want to be the UK in the EU. No euro, right? No Schengen, the difficult things you're not part of. So you have your cake and eat it. Now they realize this, I think many do, because that's, in the end, also the problem with the Remainers, right? They're not advocating this because Europe is such a great thing, right? They just want to go back to their special deal from before and spoil everything else that the Europeans want to do together. But so I do think there is going to be pressure for a people's vote. But I also don't see what that solves, right? If you have 52-48 the other way, which is what polls now suggest they will happen, do you do 2 out of 3 then? I mean, it is such an absurd situation. And also, the kind of broader British politics student in me says, but they've been at this for 40 years. They have to leave now. So they know what it's like not to be in. So next time, maybe the next generation can make a more informed decision, right? Because you're not going to get rid of this bug just imagine what the Brexiteers will say if somehow they end up staying, because there's another vote and 52-48 vote. I think that's a recipe for civil war there, right? And because again, there's going to be divided along Scotland and Northern Ireland and so on. I think this has been a great education for the British people in the last 3 years on many of the positive things that the EU is giving them. And I say that as a Eurosceptic, right? Because at the end of the day, I love the EU, but I see all the problems with this, and I see this kind of dogmatic leadership right now, and Germanic for that matter, and I've written lots of this, I've been very critical of this. But that being said, blowing it up like they're doing, I don't think it's solving anything either. On that note.
I think it's time for a party.